my veteran.
Engineering Air Vice of the Navy.
Each state has their own veteran. Mine actually was a Tuskegee Airman, and I can't believe I'm actually meeting one.
Well, Arizona, most people don't know, played a really big role in World War II. They manufactured planes and fixed planes, and they were mainly an area for training pilots. And Arizona was an ideal climate for training pilots, so it was a perfect place for beginners who were going to be pilots in Europe fighting battles.
But when the war came, most of the white males left for the war. And so minorities, that is women and African Americans, they could participate in jobs that were higher, better paying than the jobs that they had before. The legacy of those jobs kind of paved the way for them to make more progress after the war in jobs and in voting rights, in social status and things like that.
The youth in Newport itself were very active, being a Navy town, in supporting the war by either doing Red Cross stuff or just being in ROTC, helping around with like shortages, and just generally talking to the media and being really active. It's like one of the first times where you have young activists in Rhode Island is really the youth during the war.
He was in the Navy in Guam, and he flew a PBY Catalina, which was a seaplane that could be landed underwater, and he patrolled around Guam for submarines. When I learned about World War II, it was always an inspiration in the back of my mind. Was that my great-grandfather fought in this war, and I've always kind of wanted to pay I feel like I still haven't paid him enough respect.
It's really like amazing because he went into the service when he was my age. He went to basic training and we shipped off to the Berlin airlift when he was 18 or 19. So it's hard to think about like me having to go to basic training at my age to go into the Army.
He was a World War II sergeant, and he traveled through northern Africa and into Italy, and like his story just really inspired me.
When I heard about the opportunity to research my state's contribution to World War II through National History Day, I knew immediately that I wanted to interview my grandfather. I was able to hear the unfiltered view of how Wisconsin's contributions to the war affected an actual soldier. By recording my grandfather's stories and having this World War II museum, these stories will continue to be passed down for generations to come. Thank you.
To see how youth, like at that time, were doing so much for their country in a sort of global arena with the war. It's like cliche to say, but it's pretty inspiring to like see that these people are my age and they did it, so why can't I do it? Like that sort of thing. So, and it's like to be willing to go out into your own community, which seems so small, and to do these little things after school, like roll bandages for the Red Cross, or pick potatoes, like because you're in ROTC and there's no farmers because they all went to the war, to do things like that and benefit your community, but then as a whole contribute to the entire country, and then through that just like in a way spread America's freedom throughout the world it's just like something that is just really inspiring. It's just something you would want to do yourself, like, but being this young.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if everyone could please take their seats. Welcome back. I hope that those of you watching at home have all of the sessions coming in loud and crystal clear. Before I hand over the next panel to our moderator, Don Miller, I would like to introduce another oral history showcase. These showcases are put together by members of my staff in the research department. In particular, I'd like to mention Seth Paradin and Tommy Lofton for all of their hard work. We are delighted to be able to include them in this program. And so, here are two veterans who participated in amphibious operations, Joe Crane and Theo Finkbeiner.
We were constantly going on maneuvers, making landings. We had to practice. Also, the troops that we took into the beach, they had to practice. So they had to make assault landings, you know, to get everything together, dress rehearsals. So we got a lot of that. And for all practical purposes, every invasion that I made was simply another maneuver. It so happened in Sicily that my landing was the first wave. And our troops got off and went right on in, right up across the dunes and went in. We didn't have any shore fire at all that affected us. We did have some air raids. That was all that we had. We had one lone stranger that would come down the beach about 3 times a day and straight from one end to the other. And everybody'd run for cover, and whenever you got by, well, we'd go back to work. But you could see him coming, you know, so you had a chance to run, get out of the way. And he was just kicking the sand up coming down the beach. And, but outside of that, we didn't have a whole lot. But see, these beaches were strung out further than you could see in each direction. And people just can't imagine the enormity of that thing. I was working when those planes got shot down. That was in an air raid at night. The Germans used flares, and they'd come in at night and drop flares over that convoy area, because we was all going to be anchored out here in a group. And so they'd drop flares, and then they could go ahead and do their bombing. Our fleet opened up, and we were the ones that shot those paratrooper planes down, because they were coming in from North Africa. They weren't supposed to be over the convoy area. But when our fleet opened up on the German planes that were dropping the bombs, then the first thing you know, one of the C-47s come out of the air. And we were out running back and forth, making shuttle runs, hauling supplies to the beach. And I stopped by one of the planes that had went in, and I could hear a coach's whistle. And we got to checking, and there was a bunch of paratroopers in the water, and we picked a bunch of them up, and some other boats picked up some too. And for that, we hauled them back to the ship, and I like to tell people they was out there swimming in the ocean at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they wanted to ride, and we had a boat. So anyway, we took them to the ship, and then later on, I got the Legion of Merit Medal for that little act, and as did the rest of my crew.
When you go on patrol at night, you don't wear steel helmet. It's too noisy, and you can't hear good out of it. So I hardly ever wore one, because that's about all I did, really. When they found out I was a good hunter and shot, I got stuck with the patrols and outposts. I loved it at the time. I wanted to see how many of them I could kill, and you know, toward the end of the war, I got kind of leery of it. I wasn't wanting to go out there all the time. I said, sooner or later, it's going to catch up with me. But at the time, for a long time, I just loved it. I was good at it, and I wanted to do it. The more of them I could kill, the better I liked it. That's what I went over for. One time, I went on patrol that told me to get a prisoner, and there was a bridge blown out in the road, and we didn't get down the road, we was going on in, and you ease along to a place, and you stop and look and look and look and let them move, because that's what you're going to see. You're going to see movement before they see you, and ease on up just like you do some squirrels or something, and moved up across that deep gully. They'd blown that bridge out across it. I saw them come up, 3 Germans come up on the other side over there. They set up a little machine gun that's up on the other side. I guess they probably 200-300 yards maybe away from us. So I had no VAR. It's an intimidating weapon more than anything as far as killing anybody. Start shooting it at somebody, they all take cover, get down. You run out of ammunition immediately, you empty your magazine, you got to shoot 2 or 3 round bursts if you're going to do any good with it at all. Most people don't realize that, but that's, you see them movies, they're shooting brr, 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 standing up, and you can't hit anything standing up running either. That's movie stuff. That first round is the only one that's any good, and then the 2 or 3 round bursts, you do pretty good. It'll rise. You got to allow for. I usually started down around his crotch with the first shot and take a 2 or 3 round burst, and or I cut loose with it, and I killed one, and I know I hit another one, and the other guy's laying there and hollering. I think he was wounded. And anyway, they didn't any more come. He was hollering back for some more help, and so we'd found that out. We went on back, and we got ambushed on the way back, but I was bringing up the rear guard on that thing, and we was going down the road going back, and the guys up on the mountain, they could see us, and the German patrols had been our way, and they was coming down from the other direction, and all at once the fire broke loose up ahead, and we had a pretty good effect. They told me that one German, when I was shooting, and up there I had my BAR, and he had a dead aim on me when the sergeant that was in charge of patrol at the time, he said he killed him. He said he looked like he was going to put dead aim on you in your BAR, and they said he shot and killed him.
Okay. It's always great to be here in front of an audience like this, as I've often said. I teach undergraduates. It's hard to keep their attention for an hour and a half, and Rick and I were just talking how amazed we are that you guys are hanging tough, alert and alive, 3, 4, 5 o'clock. It's starting at 8. It's amazing. And it gives me faith that, in Nick Mueller's dream, I mean, he really set out to make the museum America's university of World War II studies. Let's give him a hand. Just a couple of words about our panelists, and then I'll get out of the way, leave it to the experts. I'd like to say something about both Allan and Rick as communicators of historical knowledge, public historians, because they're fighting a prejudice, a pretty widespread prejudice against military history in the American Academy. Here's kind of what they're up against. I mean, I feel it myself. At Lafayette College, I was the first, and this was 8 years ago, the first ever to teach a course on World War II history. And at a department meeting, a colleague, an untenured colleague, said to me, "Why do we have to have a course on World War II history?" Incredible. And it's no wonder that a lot of students, good students, enter and leave some of our elite colleges and universities with an abysmal knowledge of military history and along with American history. I asked a student, and this isn't a joke, I asked my students to, in my World War II class, the first time I taught it, I said, "Well, when did World War II take place?" And I asked them to write it down and then hand it in, so I wouldn't get any jokes or anything like that. And one student wrote that it took place between the Bay of Pigs and Woodstock. In the first day of my Civil War class, I gave them a little quiz, and I asked them why all Civil War battles were fought on national park land. And they started to write. That's why the profession is lucky to have an Allan Millett. We all know Allan Millett's long line of academic achievements. It's a list as long as my arm. But a lot of people don't realize that he's produced more PhDs in military history than anyone in the country, perhaps anyone in history. He's been Cleo's Johnny Appleseed, seeding the universities with World War II scholars. And his partner Rick has done more, I think, to bring military history to a broad general reading public than anyone I know. I see him as part of a long line of towering, independent scholars that go back to a line that goes back to Francis Parkman and forward to people like David McCullough. Rick's outstanding accomplishments, I think, is his ability to write big, deeply researched books that also stand by themselves as literary achievements. And reading him, frankly, is a little irritating. He's so good. Just dropped something, don't know what it is. Allan and Rick will be addressing the two major amphibious operations of 1943, Tarawa and Salerno. We'll start out with Rick. Both of these operations were, of course, deadly dangerous. Amphibious operations are the riskiest of all military operations. If they fail, it's calamity, it's catastrophe. And both of these invasions almost did. But Tarawa placed America for the first time inside Japan's defensive perimeter. And, of course, Salerno places the Allies for the first time inside Hitler's fortress Europe. Along with Kursk, I think for Germany, this was the beginning of the end. The weasel was in the chicken coop. So I'll turn it over to Rick, and then Allan will follow.
Well, thanks for that, Don, and it's delightful to be with you again today, and I can't tell you how honored I am to be here to share the stage with these two guys. So we're going to cover very quickly two large, complicated battles that occurred in Italy, and then we'll turn it over to Allan to talk about the Pacific. So by the time we get to the invasion of southern Italy in mid-1983, Allied planners have long recognized one inevitable rule of amphibious operations from the open sea, that the forces to be landed always exceed the means to transport them. Amphibious landings in the Mediterranean, beginning at Sicily in July 1943, have brought 9 new variations of landing craft and 5 new types of landing ship, including the LST, an abbreviation that meant landing ship tank, but which sailors insisted meant large, slow target. Another of these new amphibians is a 2.5-ton truck with flotation tanks and a propeller built by General Motors, and awkwardly spelled D-U-K-W, pronounced duck. It was difficult to load, it was slow in the water, it was susceptible to brake damage from salt and sand, but it was absolutely invaluable because it could carry a howitzer and its gun crew from ship to shore and then make 50 miles an hour on the road. Eisenhower had 1,100 of them at the invasion of Sicily. Another feature of amphibious warfare is that just getting a secure toehold on the hostile shore is so complex and so difficult that again and again, right through Normandy, we will see a failure to comprehensively think several jumps ahead. Amphibious doctrine stressed the capture of ports and airfields, often to the exclusion of the battle beyond the coast. In Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the plan peters out 20 miles past the landing beaches, and commanders lost sight of the larger objective, which is to seal the Strait of Messina, preventing Axis reinforcements of Sicily and forestalling an Axis escape to the Italian mainland. Escape they did. 4 German divisions and boatloads of Italians, as I mentioned this morning, which meant we'd have to fight them again in southern Italy. So, Salerno. The invasion of the Italian peninsula begins with Operation Baytown on the toe of the boot. British 8th Army under General Montgomery fires 29,000 artillery rounds across the Messina Strait from Sicily into the toe of the boot. The enemy fires 0 in reply. On September 3, 1943, 2 British divisions crossed to the mainland, largely unimpeded. There's no real effort to coordinate this 8th Army invasion with the Anglo-American 5th Army, which is scheduled to land almost 300 miles farther north at Salerno 5 days later. Mounting Baytown, that invasion into the toe, meant that Avalanche, the Salerno invasion, would be relatively small and would comprise mostly inexperienced units and commanders. From the toe of the boot to Salerno, German demolitionists wrecked bridges and road culverts, reducing Montgomery's advance with the 8th Army northward to a very ponderous crawl. The main Allied invasion at Salerno is designed to seize a big port, Naples, and to establish air bases around Foggia. If you put the map back up again, Foggia is to the northeast, and if feasible, eventually to take airfields around Rome to the north. Eisenhower 3 times asked Washington and London to temporarily double his heavy bomber force for the invasion, and he was refused 3 times. Ultra-intelligence, eavesdropping intelligence, provided a very detailed portrait of the 16 German divisions in Italy, including the 4 that had been withdrawn from Sicily. Allied intelligence believed that the German high command, faced with these Anglo-American landings, would fall back to a defensive line across northern Italy, far to the north, from Pisa to Rimini. If the Germans decided that they were going to contest the landing, the invasion at Salerno, Allied intelligence estimated that there would be 40,000 enemy troops to oppose those landings in Salerno, but that the force could grow to 100,000 within 4 days. The key in this amphibious landing, as always, is not the size of the landing force, but whether invaders could build up the beachhead faster than defenders could reinforce. Salerno has perfect hydrography. Few sandbars, a negligible tide, quite unlike Normandy, a small local port in a sheltered bay, and 22 miles of gorgeous beaches. But the littoral is hemmed in by mountains, and the landing area was likened by one Navy planner to the inside of a cup. You're down inside with mountains looking down on you. Even so, Mark Clark, who's the commander at Salerno, has hopes of being in Naples on the evening of D+2. Italian assistance was considered vital to the success of Avalanche, and there were theatrical efforts to persuade Rome to switch sides, including secret negotiations in Lisbon, a clandestine visit to Rome by General Maxwell Taylor. It went on. And as a token of good faith, I mentioned this morning, Eisenhower promised to drop the 82nd Airborne Division on Rome to protect the city from German reprisals, one of the most cockamamie schemes in all of World War II. Planes were in the air when the operation was finally canceled. The Italians surrendered anyway before the first shot is fired at Salerno. They're out of the war. There are the usual muddles in amphibious operations. As Avalanche got underway, for example, thousands of combat soldiers sailed without weapons. 50,000 assault troops were to hit the beaches, with comparable reinforcements to follow. On the 5th Army left, the British 10th Corps would land 2 infantry divisions, which would then pivot toward Naples, while on the right, 12 miles south, the U.S. 6th Corps would initially land only the 36th Division, which had been the Texas National Guard, with part of the 45th Division in reserve. The Brits planned a 15-minute naval bombardment, but the U.S. Army chose to forego any softening up by the Navy, hoping to catch the defenders by surprise. This reflected enduring Army ignorance of what the Navy could do for them. At 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, September 8th, 1943, 8 hours before the landings, Eisenhower announces Italy's surrender. The news was broadcast to the invasion fleet, and jubilant, giddy Allied soldiers assumed they would stroll across the beaches and amble on up to Naples to go to the opera. Well, it didn't happen that way. German reconnaissance aircraft had detected the assembling Allied fleet on September 6th. Convoys were then spotted on the 7th, and an alert was issued on the 8th. When the Italians capitulated, Field Marshal Kesselring, who's the theater commander for the Germans, with his usual agility, ordered his 10th Army to throw the invaders back into the sea. Defense of the Gulf of Salerno fell mainly to the 16th Panzer Division, which had been rebuilt after its annihilation at Stalingrad. It was probably the best equipped German division in Italy, 17,000 men, more than 100 tanks, and 700 machine guns. Half an hour after the landings began at 3:30 a.m. on September 9th, Luftwaffe planes attacked, and as the official U.S. Navy history noted, on a scale never before or since equaled in a Mediterranean landing. Anti-tank fire from the Germans was severe. LST-336 alone took 18 hits, and the Germans would use radio-guided bombs that raised havoc and nearly sank the cruiser Savannah, killing more than 200 sailors. Planners had hoped that the assault vanguard would be 4,000 yards inland by daylight on D-Day and far enough by dusk to suppress German artillery fire. Instead, by mid-morning, the beachhead in some places is barely 400 yards deep. Things were not much better for the British, who had captured Monte Corvino airfield 3 miles inland, but found they couldn't use it for 11 days because German gunfire was so intense. Allied air power was severely curtailed since Fifth Army had to depend on planes from Sicily and on little escort carriers. And there were more than 40 crashes by carrier-based Spitfires, mostly during deck landings, until someone came up with a bright notion of sawing off 9 inches from each propeller blade for more clearance during landings. It worked pretty well. Naval gunfire helped save the day. Destroyers at times closed to within 100 yards of the beach. 11,000 tons of naval shells would be fired at Salerno. 2/3 of the 16th Panzer Division tanks were knocked out on the first day of combat. And Kesselring's plea to Berlin to divert 2 more Panzer divisions to Salerno from northern Italy was denied. Yet the struggle would be not for the beach, but the beachhead, which by September 12th was 40 miles wide, with an average depth of only 6 miles, and in some cases it was hardly beyond rifle range. The Sele River, Don mentioned this last night, flowed between the British and American forces. It was a poor tactical oversight by Mark Clark. And as Patton, who'd been asked to look at the plan, had predicted before the invasion, the Germans used this river valley as an avenue to strike with a counterattack force that included 600 tanks and self-propelled guns. Things grew so dire, extremely critical, in Mark Clark's phrase, that Clark ordered contingency plans to be drafted for evacuating the beaches despite warnings of catastrophic losses. Among other things, loading tonnage onto landing craft in the shallows would cause them to settle lower in the water and thus exceed the backing power of the vessel's engines. General Harold Alexander, we talked about him this morning, the Army Group Commander, he arrived at Salerno with great panache, and he announced there will be no evacuation. Naval gunfire, tactical raids by B-17 heavy bombers, the successful drop of a parachute infantry regiment for reinforcement, stupendous courage, including field artillery gunners firing at point-blank range over open sights, and frictions within the German attack all helped to stop the counterattack hardly a mile from the water's edge. The Germans had shot their bolt, and the Americans and British were ashore for good. This first great battle to liberate the continent of Europe cost about 9,000 Allied casualties. Much was learned, some of it for the second or third times, about combat loading, over-the-beach resupply, and naval gunnery. No officer planning for Normandy would forget that while conventional land warfare offers a road upon which to retreat, in amphibious warfare there is no road of retirement. Eisenhower emerged from Avalanche convinced of the need to put every possible ship and aircraft into the fight during amphibious landings, and he will insist on this at Normandy. From barely 2 divisions ashore on September 3rd, the Allied host in Italy grew to 13 divisions by the end of the month, and on October 1st, they would liberate Naples and its port. Anzio is a Churchill brainstorm. It's a plan to toss 2 divisions onto the beach in an effort, as the Prime Minister put it, to decide the Battle of Rome. Similar ideas had been bandied about since the capture of Naples on October 1st, when Fifth Army planners began studying the coast of southwest Italy, particularly southwest of Rome, around Anzio. And Anzio had been an ancient Roman town. It was the birthplace of Nero and Caligula. There's a lot of resistance to this scheme, which was codenamed Shingle. At this point, the Allied drive in Italy is butting up against the Gustav Line. It's a fortified barrier that stretches for 100 miles across the Apennines to the Adriatic. Those defenses are toughest around Cassino, which is the gateway to the Liri Valley. It's the natural approach to Rome from the southeast. On this front, Mark Clark has 7 divisions in Fifth Army. They're parceled into 3 corps across a 35-mile front. Churchill will not abandon the notion of an amphibious end run around the Gustav Line. Here he's with Eisenhower in Morocco, dressed for the occasion. Churchill insists that unless we capture Rome, the world will regard our campaign as a failure, as he put it. Because, as he puts it, whoever holds Rome holds the title deeds to Italy. At this point, Eisenhower is leaving the Mediterranean, as we discussed this morning. He's going to England to plan Overlord. And even though he has doubts about the operation at Anzio, he fails to speak truth to power. He keeps those doubts to himself. Leadership in the Mediterranean is devolving to the British. Eisenhower is replaced with a malleable British Field Marshal, Jumbo Wilson, who simply observes that, as he puts it, it's a good idea to go around the enemy rather than to be bogged down in the mountains. Mark Clark, Fifth Army commander, agrees to the plan while telling his diary that he felt a pistol was being held to my head. Churchill wears them down through intimidation, endurance, and imaginative panache. It will astonish the world, he says. Again, there's pre-invasion confusion. Fifth Army wants 1,500 tons of supplies per day delivered to the beachhead, indefinitely. The Royal Navy wants to put the assault force ashore like castaways with a week's provisions and no more. Alexander voices great pleasure that Major General John Lucas is going to command the operation at Anzio, and he says Lucas, who is the best American Corps commander, planned and carried out the Salerno landing and consequently has experience of amphibious operations. Not a word of that is true. Lucas is only 54, but he seems, as one British soldier says, 10 years older than Father Christmas. Lucas writes in his diary, "I am far too tender-hearted ever to be a success at my chosen profession." He thinks the Anzio plan has, as he puts it, a strong odor of Gallipoli. This is not the guy you want in charge. The ultimate plan is to put 100,000 Anglo-Americans into the enemy rear 30 miles from Rome, starting with the U.S. 3rd and the British 1st Divisions, and then reinforcements from the U.S. 45th and 1st Armored Divisions. The intent is to force Field Marshal Kesselring to thin German defenses around Cassino to confront this threat to Highways 6 and 7, which are the main supply lines from Rome to the Cassino front. And this will then allow Fifth Army to break through at Cassino and capture Rome. Allied intelligence, again, not seeing the future very clearly, believes the Germans will withdraw when they're confronted by this pincers of the Fifth Army attacking into the Gustav Line from the southeast and the Shingle Force attacking through Anzio from the southwest. The Shingle plan is not bad in that it embodies audacity and surprise, but enough pieces of it are bad to risk rotting the whole. Alexander later says, "It was a bluff to scare the Germans into pulling back." The Germans don't bluff easily, and the Allies underestimate their ferocity and their agility. The beachhead force and Fifth Army around Cassino will be more than 60 miles apart at the outset. Moreover, the Shingle Force was sized not by the number of troops required to succeed, but by the number of divisions and ships available. This is not the way to do it. Skeptics warned that there might be enough combat power to get ashore, but not enough to get out of the beachhead. Well, the exalted ambitions for Shingle exceeded the means allocated to achieve them. Moreover, those ambitions are muddled and contradictory, especially with respect to the high ground northeast of Anzio. It's called the Colli Laziali, the Alban Hills. Here is the key terrain to this battlefield. Alexander has told Clark that he is to cut the enemy's main communications in the Colli Laziali area southeast of Rome and threaten the German rear on the Cassino front. But the Fifth Army order that Clark gives to Lucas tells him to seize and secure a beachhead at Anzio, then advance on the Colli Laziali. There's a vagueness about whether Sixth Corps is to surmount the hills or just kind of mosey toward them. Clark privately tells Lucas to first secure his beachhead, preserving his corps, and then if the enemy turns out to be supine, to lunge for the hills to sever routes 6 and 7, Highway 6 and 7. Clark tells Lucas, "Don't stick your neck out, Johnny. I did at Salerno and got into trouble. You can forget this goddamn Rome business." So Lucas's field order on January 15th lacks a detailed plan beyond the landings. What happens? The Anzio assault force, 400-ship armada, carrying Sixth Corps from Naples, lands almost unopposed on January 22nd, 1944. The British on the left, Americans on the right, Americans near the sister town of Nettuno. The beachhead by the close of D-Day is 15 miles wide and 4 miles deep. Clark and Alexander show up that afternoon on a fast boat out of Naples. They declare themselves very satisfied. They get back on the boat and they leave. The BBC reports that Alexander's brave troops should reach Rome within 48 hours. No one tells the Germans. They're surprised, to be sure. Field Marshal Kesselring has just sent his reserves, 2 Panzer Grenadier divisions, to the Cassino front, precisely as the Allied planners had hoped, because there are attacks being made there, and Kesselring feels obliged to reinforce. Only 3 battalions remain to guard the invasion coast. But, again with great alacrity under a plan codenamed Richard, reinforcements from as far away as France and the Balkans begin to converge on the Colli Laziali, the Alban Hills, in what Kesselring calls a higgledy-piggledy jumble. Allied interdictory bombing of train lines is less effective than had been hoped. Within 3 days, portions of 8 German divisions are at or near the beachhead, with 5 more en route. They have the high ground, and German demolitionists flood the low ground approaches toward the Alban Hills. On D+3, 56,000 Allied troops are in the beachhead. The beachhead now is 7 miles deep, 7,000 vehicles. Alexander shows up again. He tells Lucas, "What a splendid piece of work. This will really hurt the Germans." But every square inch is within range of German guns. Roger and Alex are going to talk about fighting in Italy, including Anzio, a little later this afternoon. So we're going to pause the battle here with Lucas cautiously pushing his forces toward the key road junctions at Campoleone and Cisterna. It doesn't go well. The Allied force will be bottled up for 4 months under a tremendous bloody pounding, and Lucas, who will be sacked a month after the invasion, would be excoriated for decades for his supposed lack of audacity and imagination. I personally believe that his prudence was sensible and even inevitable given the woolly instructions that had been given to him. Had that small Allied force rushed pell-mell for the hills near Rome, it's likely the entire corps would have been obliterated. Even George Marshall, who rarely deigned to adjudicate tactical matters, noted that for every mile of advance, there were 7 or more miles to be added to the perimeter, increasing your vulnerability, which would have made those Allied flanks even more susceptible to a devastating German counterattack. I'll leave it there, and we'll give it to Allan. Thank you.
I'm not really sure I'm up to this because they've left me with 2 clickers, and I don't know which one to use, but I introduced some of the problems and characters yesterday involved with the Operation Galvanic, which is the invasion of Tarawa. But let me try to draw a somewhat larger picture. It occurred to me this morning while I was amphibiously bathing that there is a simultaneity in operations in the Pacific at toward the end of 1943 that somehow had escaped me in the past, which is that not only is there an operation into the Gilbert Islands, the Tarawa operation, and Macon Island, but it occurs slightly after landings of the 1st Marine Division on Cape Gloucester, on New Britain Island, and then shortly after Tarawa, you have the 3rd Marine Division landing on Bougainville on the 1st of December. So the FMF at the time, Fleet Marine Force, 3 divisions, actually 4, but the 4th Division hadn't made any operations yet. But it's interesting that all 3 of these operations are happening more or less at the same time, and all of them face somewhat different problems, and fortunately work out. But they represent in some ways 3 very, very different kinds of sets of problems attached to amphibious operations. First of all, it puts a strain on shipping. As Rick pointed out, and I've learned from personal experience, a landing force commander can have a wonderful scheme of maneuver ashore, have made clever plans to conduct his mission, landing, but the shipping is never adequate. all the great plans still are fundamentally driven by just how many ships you get to move your forces. And it also includes the type of ships that are available as well. In the operations that were taking place at the end of 1943, the ones at Cape Gloucester and at Bougainville, they did not face serious coral reef problems, which meant that the beaching ships like LSTs and other types of vessels that could ram up into the jungle or marginal beaches could get people ashore. But once you move into the Central Pacific and atoll warfare, then you've got the coral reef problem to deal with. And that then produces a problem, which is, can you get over the coral reefs? What kind of vehicles or small boats do you have available to do that? And the answer usually is not enough of whatever. When the 2nd Marine Division began to plan to take a look at the landing at Tarawa, it was very clear that there was a serious problem in terms of dealing with coral reefs. And that the central answer was, we've got to use amphibian tractors of some kind. They had been deployed at Guadalcanal, logistical vehicles. No one had made an assault with them yet. But it was pretty clear that somebody had to figure out how to get over the coral reefs, and that amphibian tractors really were the only answer. In the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, there were 75 tracks, some of them pretty well worn out after Guadalcanal, and no one doing the planning thought that was an adequate number. And so the first decision, which actually went the Marine Corps' way, was to insist that 100 new LVT-2s, which were sitting in California, be rushed to the Pacific and be available to the 2nd Division and landing at Tarawa. Immediately, inter-service difficulties arose because Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner and Admiral Nimitz, people, Spruance, who were involved, decided that to give the Army its share, that 50 of the new tracks would go to the Army Forces 165th Infantry that was making the assault on Macon Island. This was terribly upsetting because we knew that the reef conditions around Macon Island and the size of the landing hardly justified the assignment of 50 brand new LVTs to the 165th Infantry, that all 100 of them probably should have gone to the 2nd Division, which would then have given them about 175 tracks. The estimate was that to make this operation at all feasible, the division probably should have 300 amphibian tractors. Now, why was this so essential? The reefs around Bayshore Island was such that there was huge uncertainty as to whether it would ever have 4 feet of water covering it at high tide. The tidal conditions were actually reasonably well known. An Australian coastal captain said he doubted that the tide would ever get up over the reef 4 feet. If you didn't have 4 feet of water over the reef, you weren't ever going to get any of the LCVPs or LCMs or other types of landing craft into the lagoon around the north side of Bayshore Island. There was a lot of debate about the position of the moon, as some of you who do water sports and things can understand. Tidal conditions do count. And this happened to be a time of the year in which the gravitational relationship between the moon and the earth were such that the tides were very, very weak, so that the difference between low tide and high tide was going to be insignificant. And in fact, at no time during the operation did any of the flat-bottomed LCVPs or LCMs really get across the reef that bordered Bayshore Island. The distance between the reef and the island was about 800 yards at minimum. Well, how was this going to work? Well, in the middle of all this, Holland M. Smith and Admiral Turner decided that the 2nd Division didn't need all the troops that they had, so therefore one whole regiment, a third of the infantry battalion of the 2nd Division, would be placed in force reserve, which meant that Julian Smith, the commander of the division, would not have access to those 3 battalions unless they were released to him. That meant that he had only 6 battalions, probably, to make this landing. And most of the planners, then Colonel David Shoup, were quite concerned about the fact that they didn't really believe that the first 3 battalions that would make the assault would be adequate enough to establish a sufficient beachhead, that they would probably need to use all 6 of the battalions they had available, which would leave them virtually nothing in reserve. There was good intelligence about the Japanese fortifications. There were about 500 different bunkers and defense structures on the island, up to including 8-inch naval guns purchased from the British. There were lots of 75 millimeter anti-tank, anti-air cannon, heavy machine guns. The place had had 18 months to prepare defenses to meet a landing. No, this was not a good deal. Hopefully, naval gunfire would allow at least sufficient destruction so that the landing force stood some chance of getting ashore. The naval gunfire plan, however, was reduced to about 3.5 hours, and it followed a doctrine that had not yet really been tested, which was that suppression fires from all of the 5-inch guns, 6-inch guns, up to 14-inch guns available in the fleet would neutralize a target. Now, that's a word you have to be very careful about. It's sort of like being told that you don't have command, you can coordinate. Well, you don't worry about that a little bit. In this case, someone says, we're going to neutralize them. That means we're going to scare them. They'll be down in their little rinky-dinky holes, all dazed and confused. Well, that's fine and dandy, but what if they get over being dazed and confused? They have a way of popping up and grabbing weapons, and you've got some serious problems. But it was literally sort of World War I artillery doctrine, which is if you put X number of tons of shells upon some particular piece of ground, that would then ensure that whatever the defenses were would be overcome. It turned out, of course, that was nonsense, that you had to actually pinpoint naval gunfire at specific targets and knock them out. Just sort of dumping a lot of shells on the island were not sufficient. Murphy's Law struck often during the November the 20th, 1943. Interestingly, I think most of the problems that appeared were actually anticipated by the 2nd Division, but they simply didn't have the wherewithal or the influence to overcome them very easily. So the landing went something like this. 3 waves of amphibian tractors bearing 3 different infantry battalions plunged into the north shore of Basho Island. Only one of the battalions, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, got ashore with anything like efficiency, cohesion. The other 2 battalions were pretty much shot to pieces. One had 50% casualties, the other about 75% casualties. The amphibian tractors worked wonderfully, except that once they hit the seawall that defined the northern shore of Basho Island, they couldn't get over the seawall. And so the tractors that made it ashore simply plowed into the seawall, and then people tumbled out over the top of the tracks because there were no other exit other than tumbling out of the top, right into the face of Japanese machine guns. The number of tracks that were actually sunk on the way in. It was relatively small, about 8, we think. But by the time the tracks had retracted and gone back to the reef to get another load, about 15 of them sank from all the holes that had been shot in them because they weren't very well armored. In fact, the armor that had been put on had been a kind of sudden extemporized armoring of vehicles. Now, you know you've got problems when the lieutenant colonel, who was the commander of the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, is killed firing a 50 caliber machine gun off the deck of an Amtrak that can't retract. The executive officer also was out there somewhere and was wounded. The Amphibian Tractor Battalion, by the time the operation ended, it started with 500 effectives, and it had about 150 people left to operate the tracks. Well, they didn't have many tracks to operate anyway. 125 tracks, they ended up with about 30 that were still operational after a couple of days of the operation. The plan had been for the tracks to go back out to the reef and pick up the next wave of reinforcements. And it proved to be a very, very difficult process. And so the option was then, let's get out of the LCVPs, cross the reef, and wade some 800 yards into the beach area. Nobody thought this was a really good deal because the Japanese were still very much alive, very much shooting. And so the succeeding reinforcements, one battalion on D-Day, then one battalion on the second day, faced horrendous losses, just basically trying to get ashore without having any kind of effectiveness at all. So 2 of the battalions that would have been reinforcing battalions were basically eliminated as cohesive forces. The one thing that sort of saved the operation was that there was a pier that extends about 1,000 yards from the island out to the reef. And that's where coastal steamers and others actually had unloaded and then, brought their supplies and things in. The Scout Sniper Platoon of the 2nd Division, led by a lieutenant named Bill Hawkins, actually took the pier right at the very beginning of the operation. Although they continued to fight Japanese who kept trying to man the positions within the pier. Once the pier was seized, it became a barrier to Japanese fire from the west and something of a shield from Japanese fire to the east. So that if the pier had not been there, you can't get casualties out, which are taken out basically on rubber rafts, and the reinforcements can't come in using this long pier as for cover. Not only did the Japanese prove to be very aggressive in their defenses, but the communications among all different control elements of the 2nd Division didn't work. And so nobody really knew what the situation was all the way up to General Smith himself. One Marine general, the assistant division commander, actually came in, had no communications, stood around in the water for about 12 hours, and finally then went back to the ship. He was called a coward the rest of his life. He couldn't communicate with anybody, so he might as well have gone back. One battalion commander couldn't get ashore and communicated that he didn't need to get ashore anyway because his battalion had been wiped out. That didn't go over well either, I might add, with Colonel Shoup and others. Fortuitously, part of one battalion all the way to the western edge of the island refused to enter this sort of concave area called the pocket. I can tell you if you're doing amphibious landings, you do not want to land in a concave area where people are shooting at you from both directions. And so Mike Ryan, retired as a major general, took his company and they landed not on the red beach where they were supposed to be, but they sort of went around the tip of the island and established an enclave at what was called Green Beach. And in fact, that became the place where at least 2 battalions managed to get ashore more or less cohesively the next day. Without going into any more gruesome operational detail, let me run down some of the lessons that were learned. It's pretty interesting because most of these problems were anticipated by the Marines, and to a large degree it was a matter of trying to sell the Navy on the fact that there were some reforms that needed to be made. One was that you needed to have very prolonged, maybe even several days, worth of naval gunfire, and that the naval gunfire should be observed and adjusted either by airborne observers or once you got ashore by naval gunfire spot teams, so that the largest anti-boat, anti-shipping guns that were on the island would be knocked out, destroyed in some fashion. Another lesson was that you needed to establish a very robust system of people who could adjust naval gunfire and airstrikes. And so after Tarawa, the Marine Corps and the Navy established what were known as joint amphibious assault signal companies, which actually included Army personnel as well. Today, the Marine Corps calls them Anglicos, but they're designed basically as groups of indirect fire spotters who can work with any portion of the armed forces to bring in naval gunfire and airstrikes. Marine Corps was not happy with the degree of inefficiency of naval aviation in striking land targets. They seemed to bomb the wrong people at the wrong time. It's not fun being strafed by your own people. There were clearly some very, very severe coordination problems that needed to be solved. Another aspect was there needed some kind of organization to blow holes in the reefs so that you could at least get some small boats inside a lagoon if necessary. And the Navy then established underwater demolition teams who would then conduct such demolition operations. LVTs, tracks, they became the coin of the realm. The more the merrier. There was a movement also to establish amphibian tractors with mounted turrets, first with a 37 millimeter gun, then with a 75 millimeter gun that would be sort of a supporting direct fire cannon available to the infantry. They were not tanks, and people who tried to use them as tanks found out that they got knocked out very quickly. Marine Corps also had its first experience with the Sherman tank at Tarawa. Difficulty was they dumped them in the water. They couldn't get them in to the beach, and so 14 tanks started off and they stalled in the water, and guides were shot, and they went into craters, and when all was said and done, they had about 2 or 3 of them that were effective for a very short period of time, but they worked very nicely. Somebody also suggested that wouldn't it be nice to have tanks that were flamethrowers? That was another idea that took hold. Infantry should be trained to handle demolitions and flamethrowers, not wait for engineers to do that sort of business. It really is quite, I won't say surprising, but heartening to realize that most of the things that were identified at Tarawa as problems were those that could be solved, and that by the time the 4th Division landed at Roy Namur, Operation Kwajalein and Weetalk, the Marshals, most of these landings went very, very smoothly using the kinds of techniques and experiences that had been absorbed from the operations at Tarawa. I think we shall go to questions there, Don. Well, thank you very much.
So we have lots of time for questions and for our panelists. Yes, sir.
I'm one of those readers you all have been talking about. I'm just a history buff in World War II and enjoyed hearing the stories my parents and grandparents told me. But I've really enjoyed this. I learned in 1943 that our bombers were getting shot out of the sky, and it didn't matter too much because they weren't bombing what they wanted to bomb in the first place. Our generals and admirals couldn't get along with each other. They made some stupid decisions on places to land and how to land. Our submarine commanders weren't interested in fighting the enemy. And so I can't imagine, although I know we did, how we won this war. And so I guess I'm going to have to come back next year and find out that how we managed to win the war.
We hooked him, Nick.
By the way, we did a trip to Italy, a cruise, and it was one depressing operation after the other. And a couple of people said exactly the same thing at the end, like, why were we here, and how in the hell did we win this and the wider war? So a sentiment shared by many.
I think that a real lesson, which is that you really don't know how any of this stuff is going to work until you take it to the enemy. You don't know how commanders are going to respond. Lucas, people thought he was a good Corps commander. He's terrible. You have equipment that doesn't work the way you thought it would or should. You have doctrinal problems suddenly that pop up. And you think you know what you're doing, and then it turns out that the people you're working with don't. And it turns out, for example, that British and American methods of handling naval gunfire were very, very different. You have communications problems. Anybody that's, strapped on a pistol or whatever knows that the first thing that happens is the comm goes out. And so you've got to, you don't really fully appreciate what you need to do to create redundant communication systems that will allow you to operate. But until you're in the field doing these things, particularly under combat conditions, no one can really be sure any of it's going to work.
Also, I think we've been stressing the deficiencies, inadequacies, screw-ups of the Allied side primarily. If we were to focus on the Germans in Italy, for example, or the Japanese in the Pacific, with greater granularity, I think you would see that they have even bigger problems than the Allied forces did. So war, needless to say, can be messy under the best circumstances, but I think in general, the answer to your question is, which we'll try to get into in greater detail next year, is that it was less messy for us than it was for them. Among other things, we had more of everything. And you heard the discussion of tank production and so on, and you got some sense of what the German deficiencies were in trying to make tanks. They made good tanks, but they didn't make nearly as many as they needed. And you multiply that across the war-making spectrum, and you can get to some sense for why it is that we prevailed despite these deficiencies that you so correctly identified.
We have a question for you on the left.
Gentlemen, do you think we should have bypassed Tarawa?
No, somebody was going to have to take on a defended atoll someplace, sometime, because that was the real challenge. We knew that we could take beaching ships into big islands and find some place that wasn't defended. That's what happened in the South Pacific. But if you're going to move across the Central Pacific, then you're going to eventually have to attack somebody sometime, somewhere. And Tarawa was, or Bayshore Island certainly was perfectly legitimate objective. Having been over all this several times in my writing, I think the only really inexcusable operation is Peleliu. I think that one that should have been called off, and that the reasons for justifying that had disappeared by the time the operation was actually mounted. But I can find, I think, reasonable rationales for the other choices of objectives.
We have a question to your left.
At the start of the Guadalcanal campaign, Nimitz had Carlson's raiders land on Macon Island as a diversion. And from what I've always read, the Japanese were made highly aware of how weak their defenses at the periphery of the Gilberts were. Did we realize that was kind of a bad move at that point? I know in history books now they say, yeah, it was a bad move, but did the Central Pacific staff realize that at that point?
What, the Macon Island raid was a bad idea?
Basically, the fact that Tarawa's defenses were built up considerably.
Well, they knew what the defenses are. I've seen copies of the maps that were drawn up, and through aerial reconnaissance, and particularly, and submarines go in, put up the periscope, and they look, and they had a pretty good idea just how tough the defenses were. And the choice was made, in fact, to enter the lagoon and attack the northern edge of the island rather than the southern or open edge, simply because the open or southern edge of the island, about 3 miles long, was far better fortified. The key thing is stay away from mines. That's a fairly serious matter. And the ocean approaches to the island had been mined, but the lagoon side had not. And that's a big consideration, because you brought in naval gunfire ships. There are 2 destroyers that get inside the lagoon, which do good work. They brought the transports inside the lagoon. There are all kinds of things going on inside the lagoon that would have been very difficult to do had they been mined.
A question for you on the right.
To my esteemed conference colleague over here who asked how we won the war with all the questions Rick and the other speaker were saying, this is my high school football coach who landed at Salerno and Anzio, fought through Italy with the 36th Infantry Division, then landed at Operation Animal in southern France, was wounded in Germany about a month before the war ended. This is how we won the war.
That's great.
We have a question in the back to your left.
Just a brief comment following up on Allan Millett's presentation. 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to interview a Navy captain named Frank Gadd. And Gadd was an amphibious officer who, at the time of Tarawa, was on Turner's staff. And he said, from his perspective, Turner simply didn't understand how to use naval gunfire support for amphibious landings. He said Turner said to him, this is going to be the biggest amphibious gunfire support operation the world has ever seen. And when it's all through, the Marines are just going to have a wading ashore party down there. And then later he talked about the gunfire support, and of course what they did is they didn't intersperse the shells with armor-piercing shells on the targets. And so he said at one point, and they used contact fuses, and all that did was dust the sand off the tops of the underground shelters.
Yeah, one of the things they discovered was once they got to the airfield on Bayshore Island, there were all these unexploded 14-inch shells that had just skimmed off the various fortifications that the Japanese had built, largely with palm logs and sandbags with concrete and some metallic plating. I mean, they're very, very clever fortifications.
A question here in the front.
we have the introduction of Kesselring, and I know he plays a big role. Could you evaluate his generalship during the Italian campaign?
Yeah, we had the misfortune of running into Kesselring repeatedly, first in North Africa and then in Italy, and we will run into him yet again. He's the last theater commander on the Western Front at the end of the war in 1945 in Western Europe. Kesselring is an interesting character. He's not a Prussian, he's a Bavarian. He's known as Smiling Albert because he always has this big toothy grin on his face. He's got Bavarian bonhomie. He learns to fly relatively late in his career, becomes a Luftwaffe general. He's shot down 5 times in the course of the war. So he's not only Smiling Albert, he's Lucky Albert. He's got first of all, he's got Hitler's ear, which is very important in a field marshal in the German Wehrmacht. And he's really got, you have to say, the measure of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean for the first year plus. He recognizes, first of all, the greenness of the force that comes into North Africa in November 8, 1942, and he knows how to exploit that. He knows how to react very quickly, how to move forces around quickly, not only across to North Africa in 1942, but from all over, really all over the Reich. I mentioned the fact that when they begin to reinforce at Salerno, they're pulling troops, he's pulling troops, not only from France, but from the Balkans. He has an ongoing argument over whether or not Italy should be abandoned with the German high command, whether Italy should, southern Italy should be given up. And as an airman, he knows that allowing British and American air forces to move in to become what will be 15th Air Force is really toxic for the German cause, that if you allow them to have those great airfields that are not too far away from Salerno and to begin building up in a way that American airfield builders could do remarkably, that was going to add another front to an already besieged Reich with American and British bombers flying from Italy. So, you know, my general impression of Kesselring, having lived with him now for 15 years, is he's an unfortunate adversary to have against you in Italy. His luck runs out eventually, and we wipe the smile off his face, I have to say. Although he spends 5 years in prison after he's apprehended in 1945, he spends a good part of that time, as many of the German generals did, having been encouraged by us, writing about his war and about his views of how to wage war and so on. So he had an opportunity to get in and to burnish his own reputation. And so I think his writings after the war always have to be taken with a grain of salt.
He's the ultimate Teflon field marshal.
Yeah, he is.
The stuff that he passes off on others, clever, I mean, and he manipulates the high command in Berlin. And if you want to model yourself after
He'll be charged with war,
Slicky,
he'll be charged with war crimes. The Ardeatine massacre outside of Rome, that's on his watch. And yet somehow, as Allan says, he's Teflon. He's not sent to the gallows for that. It's not clear that he was personally responsible for it, but there are atrocities that certainly occur with his knowledge after the fact. So among the German high command, you have to think that Kesselring is really in the top rank.
For example, the German army massacred hundreds, probably thousands of Italian soldiers after the Italian surrender. And because they were afraid they were going to switch over to the Allies. That's another story that doesn't often get told.
Yeah. Yeah, one final remark. It's kind of interesting, Bob Sherrod, who I talked about last night, who covered the battle and wrote a terrific book about it. he was walking around surveying the ground after the slaughter, and he said it'd be hard to communicate this. He said because you can't communicate a smell. But as he's walking around, he notices that, of course, as Allan said, on the day of the invasion, it was a dodging tide and it was low. And the day he walked around, the fourth day, the tide was high, okay? But then he went to the spot where the Marines had landed, their beachhead, and it was swamped. He said if the tide had been high that day, those Marines on the beachhead with Crow and Hatch and those guys might have been, swamped, grounded, drowned. Interesting. Thank you. Thank our panelists.
Thank you to our panelists. Please remember to drop off your cards in the wicker basket for questions for General Petraeus. We'll take our panelists next door for book signing, and please be back for 4:50 for our last session of the day.